The water in the Pool of Siloam that morning reflected a sky still caught between night and dawn. But it was not the tranquility of the water that defined that moment. It was not the gentle ripple caused by the first pilgrims descending the worn stone steps, though that too was part of the scene. It was something deeper, more ancient, something woven into the very fabric of Jewish identity that had been passed down through generations like a sacred fire that must never be extinguished. The pool was not simply a place to wash. It was a gateway, a threshold between the profane and the holy, between the dust of the world and the purity required to stand before God Himself. The year is 33 Anno Domini. The city is Jerusalem during Feast Week, and what you are about to witness is not merely a religious ritual, but the living, breathing heartbeat of a people who understood that approaching the divine required preparation, sacrifice, and the washing away of everything that separated them from their Creator. To understand what happened at the Pool of Siloam on a Feast Week morning, you must first understand the city that contained it. Jerusalem in the year 33 was not a city at rest. During Passover week, its normal population of approximately 80,000 inhabitants multiplied exponentially. Some estimates suggest the population swelled to nearly 300,000 people, perhaps more. Imagine that. Every available room, every courtyard, every patch of ground outside the city walls became temporary shelter for pilgrims who had traveled from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome, from the furthest reaches of the known world. They came because the law commanded it. 3 times a year, every Jewish male was required to appear before the Lord in Jerusalem for the great feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. This was not optional. This was not a suggestion. This was covenant obligation, written in the Torah itself, binding every generation to the rhythm of pilgrimage and worship. Now picture yourself among them. You have traveled for weeks, maybe months. Your feet are covered in the dust of Roman roads. Your clothes carry the smell of campfires and crowded caravansaries. Your body aches from sleeping on hard ground. But none of that matters now because you can see it, rising before you on Mount Moriah, gleaming in the early morning light, the Temple of Jerusalem. Not the ruins we see today, not the archaeological fragments, but the living, functioning, magnificent Temple of Herod with its walls of white stone and gold, its massive courts, its constant activity of priests and Levites and worshippers, its smoke of incense and sacrifice rising toward heaven like prayers made visible. This is what you have come for. This is what your ancestors came for. This is the center of the world, the place where heaven and earth meet, where the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has chosen to place His name. But there is a problem. You cannot simply walk into the temple. You are not pure, not yet. The journey has made you impure. The dust of the road clings to you, yes, but the impurity goes deeper than physical dirt. According to the laws of ritual purity laid out in Leviticus and elaborated in generations of rabbinic teaching, you have likely contracted tuma, ritual impurity, in a dozen different ways during your journey. Perhaps you touched a dead animal on the road. Perhaps you came into contact with someone who was themselves impure. Perhaps a woman in your traveling party was menstruating. Perhaps you yourself experienced a bodily discharge. Any of these things, and countless others, would render you tameh, ritually impure, and therefore unable to enter the temple courts, unable to participate in the feast, unable to fulfill the very purpose for which you traveled all this distance. This is where the Pool of Siloam enters the story. This is why, on a feast week morning in 33 Anno Domini, the pool was not a quiet, contemplative place. It was packed, crowded, bustling with humanity, an essential bottleneck in the spiritual preparation of an entire nation. The pool was located in the lower city, in the area known as the City of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem. To reach it, pilgrims would descend from the Temple Mount, wind through narrow streets, pass through neighborhoods where the poorer residents of Jerusalem lived, in houses stacked one upon another, until finally they reached the southern end of the city where the Pool of Siloam waited, fed by the waters of the Gihon Spring through Hezekiah's tunnel, that engineering marvel carved through solid rock more than 7 centuries earlier. Let me paint you the scene more precisely. It is perhaps 4 or 5 in the morning, maybe earlier. The sky is beginning to lighten, but the sun has not yet risen over the Mount of Olives. The air is cool, carrying that particular crispness that Jerusalem mornings have in the spring. The pool itself is rectangular, with steps descending on multiple sides, perhaps 30 or 40 feet across, not enormous but substantial. The water is clear, constantly refreshed by the spring that feeds it. Around the pool, colonnades provide some shelter, some structure to the space. And everywhere, there are people. Imagine standing at the edge of that pool as dawn approaches. The noise alone would be overwhelming. Hundreds of voices speaking dozens of languages and dialects. Hebrew, yes, but also Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Egyptian, languages from Parthia and Media and Elam. You hear prayers being murmured, psalms being recited, instructions being given, children crying, mothers soothing, men debating fine points of purity law, merchants selling towels and clean garments, beggars asking for alms. The acoustic effect of all these voices in the stone amphitheater of the pool area creates a constant hum, a human symphony of pilgrimage and devotion. Now observe the people themselves. They come from every economic level. You see wealthy pilgrims accompanied by servants, wearing fine linen, carrying expensive oils and perfumes for the purification process. You see poor farmers from Galilee, their clothes simple and worn, their faces weathered by sun and wind, but their eyes shining with devotion. You see families, whole extended clans traveling together, grandparents and parents and children and infants. You see scribes and Pharisees, recognizable by their phylacteries and the fringes of their garments. You see Sadducees, members of the priestly aristocracy. You see foreigners, God-fearing Gentiles who have attached themselves to the God of Israel, who keep some of the law though they are not fully Jewish. And you see something else. You see hope mixed with anxiety. Because the question of ritual purity was not simple. It was not straightforward. The laws were complex, layered, sometimes unclear. The Pharisees and the Sadducees debated constantly about the proper interpretation of these laws. The school of Hillel said one thing, the school of Shammai said another. What if you had done something that made you impure but did not realize it? What if your purification was not sufficient? What if you were turned away from the temple, your pilgrimage wasted, your sacrifice rejected? These were not theoretical concerns. The temple guards, the Levites who controlled access to the holy places, took ritual purity seriously, very seriously. They would examine pilgrims, ask questions, make judgments about who could enter and who could not. To travel all that distance, to spend all that money, to invest all that hope and devotion, only to be turned away at the entrance to the temple. It was a fear that haunted every pilgrim. This is why the Pool of Siloam mattered so much. This is why people came in such numbers, so early in the morning, willing to wait, willing to immerse themselves in water that dozens, hundreds of others had already used. Let me explain the theology behind this practice because it is crucial to understanding not just what happened at the pool, but the entire worldview of Second Temple Judaism. The concept of ritual purity was not about hygiene, not primarily. Yes, washing made you physically clean, but that was almost beside the point. Ritual purity was about holiness, about separation, about the fundamental conviction that the holy God of Israel required his people to approach him in a state of purity that symbolized moral and spiritual cleanliness. The system of ritual purity was one of the ways that Israel remained distinct from the nations around them. It was a daily, constant reminder that they were set apart, consecrated, holy to the Lord. The laws of purity divided the world into categories. There was the pure and the impure, the holy and the common, the clean and the unclean. These categories were not arbitrary. They were built into creation itself, woven into the fabric of reality by God at the beginning. Certain things were inherently pure, life-giving water from a natural spring, for example. Certain things were inherently impure, corpses, certain animals, certain bodily discharges. To become impure was not necessarily a sin. Often it was unavoidable. Touching a dead body, for instance, might be necessary to bury a loved one. But whether it was sinful or not, impurity had consequences. It meant you could not enter holy space. It meant you could not participate in holy rituals. It meant you were, temporarily, cut off from the worship life of your community. The solution was purification, and purification required water. Not just any water, but living water. Water from a natural source, a spring, a river, rainwater collected in a ritual bath called a mikveh. The Pool of Siloam qualified because it was fed by the Gihon spring, a natural source. The act of immersion in this living water symbolized transformation. the washing away of impurity, the restoration of the person to a state of ritual cleanness. The person would descend into the water completely, every part of the body submerged, not a single hair remaining dry, and then emerge on the other side, reborn in a sense, restored, made fit once again to approach God. But here is what you need to understand. The purification at the Pool of Siloam was often not the end of the process. It was the beginning. Many forms of impurity required not just immersion, but also sacrifice. Not just water, but also blood. A woman after childbirth, for example, had to immerse herself, but she also had to bring a lamb and a pigeon to the temple. Someone who had touched a corpse had to undergo a 7-day purification process involving special water mixed with the ashes of a red heifer, with immersions on the 3rd and 7th days, and then a final sacrifice. The system was intricate, demanding, expensive. It bound the people to the temple, to the priesthood, to the constant cycle of ritual and sacrifice that defined Jewish life in the 1st century. So there at the Pool of Siloam, on a feast week morning in the year 33, what you are witnessing is not just people taking a bath. You are witnessing an entire theological worldview in action. You are seeing people who take seriously the holiness of God, the sinfulness of man, the need for mediation, the requirement of purity, the efficacy of ritual, the hope of restoration. These are not superstitious peasants mindlessly following tradition. These are people who have thought deeply about what it means to be human, what it means to be in relationship with the divine, what it means to live as a holy people in a fallen world. Watch them descend into the water. An old man, his beard long and gray, his body bent with age, carefully making his way down the stone steps, his son supporting him on one side. A young woman, newly married perhaps, her face solemn with concentration as she prepares to immerse herself, her female relatives around her to ensure modesty and proper procedure. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, his hand gripping his father's hand tightly, his eyes wide as he sees the pool for the first time, hears the prayers, feels the sacred seriousness of this moment. A group of men from the diaspora, speaking Greek among themselves, their accents marking them as foreigners, but their devotion marking them as sons of Abraham nonetheless. Each immersion follows a pattern. First, the removal of any barriers between the body and the water. Jewelry, bandages, even dried mud caked on the skin, all must be removed because the water must touch every part of the body simultaneously. Then the prayer, often the traditional blessing, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning immersion." Then the descent into the water, the complete submersion, the momentary disappearance beneath the surface, and then the rise, the emergence, the water streaming from hair and beard and garments, and the sense, whether mystical or merely psychological, that something has changed, that a weight has been lifted, that purity has been restored. But the pool is not large enough for everyone who needs it. Lines form, extending back through the streets. People wait their turn with varying degrees of patience. Tensions flare sometimes. Someone tries to cut in line. Someone takes too long in the water. Someone's purity is questioned by others. Arguments break out, quickly suppressed by community leaders who remind everyone that this is a holy place, that quarreling here defeats the very purpose of purification. The temple is waiting. The feast is approaching. There is no time for division or dispute. And throughout all of this, there is the awareness of the temple itself, looming over the city, visible from almost everywhere, its presence a constant reminder of why all this matters. The pilgrims at the Pool of Siloam are not washing to feel better about themselves. They are washing because the law requires it, because God requires it, because admission to the temple depends on it. The temple is the goal. The temple is the destination. The temple is where God dwells among his people, where sacrifices are offered, where sins are atoned for, where prayers ascend like incense, where heaven and earth touch. Now let me tell you something that adds another layer to this scene. In the year 33 Anno Domini, there was a man in Jerusalem who had recently said something extraordinary about water and purity. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, and though he was not at the Pool of Siloam on this particular feast week morning, his words had reached there nonetheless. During a previous feast, possibly the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus had stood in the temple courts and cried out, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, Streams of living water will flow from within him. It was a shocking claim, an audacious claim. He was saying, in effect, that he himself was the source of living water, that he could provide the purification, the life, the spiritual cleansing that people sought in pools and rituals and sacrifices. And there was more. On another occasion, Jesus had healed a man who had been blind from birth. How did he heal him? He spat on the ground, made mud with the saliva, put the mud on the man's eyes, and then told him, "Go, wash in the Pool of Siloam." The man went, he washed, and he came back seeing. The Pool of Siloam, that place of purification, became the site of a miracle that pointed to something greater than ritual purity. It pointed to spiritual sight, to enlightenment, to salvation itself. Some of the people at the pool that morning in 33 Anno Domini knew about Jesus. Some had heard him teach. Some had seen his miracles. Some were his followers, though perhaps secretly, afraid of what the religious authorities might do. And some were hostile, convinced that he was a blasphemer, a false teacher, a threat to everything they held sacred. The debates about Jesus, about his claims, about his authority, about whether he was the Messiah or a deceiver, these debates were happening everywhere in Jerusalem during Feast Week, and they were certainly happening at the Pool of Siloam, in the line of pilgrims waiting to immerse themselves, in the whispered conversations between friends and family members. Imagine one such conversation. Two brothers, perhaps, standing in line together. One says, "I heard him speak. I heard what he said about living water. What if he is right? What if all of this, all these rituals, all these purifications, what if they are just shadows of something greater? What if he is the reality they point to?" The other brother shakes his head. "Do not talk like that," he says. "It is dangerous. The Pharisees are watching. The chief priests are listening. You do not want to be associated with him. Not now. Not during the feast when the Romans are watching everything, when any disturbance could lead to violence. And besides, how can you question the law? How can you question what Moses gave us? This is how we have always done it. This is how our fathers did it, and their fathers before them. Who is this carpenter from Nazareth to overturn everything?" But the first brother is not convinced. He has seen something in Jesus, heard something in his words that will not let him go. He thinks about the blind man, about how Jesus used the very water of this pool to perform a miracle. He thinks about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman to whom Jesus offered living water, saying that whoever drinks of the water he gives will never thirst again. He thinks about the contrast between the crowded, complicated, anxiety-producing ritual of purification he is about to undergo and the simple, direct, gracious offer Jesus makes. "Come to me, believe in me, drink from me." These two visions of purity, these two understandings of how to approach God, are colliding in Jerusalem in the spring of 33 Anno Domini. The old way, the way of the law, the way of ritual and sacrifice and priestly mediation, and the new way, the way Jesus is proclaiming, the way of faith, grace, and direct access to God through him. At the Pool of Siloam, on this feast week morning, both ways are present. Most people are following the old way, faithfully, sincerely, doing what generations before them have done. But a few, a growing few, are beginning to wonder if there is another way, a better way, a way that will make all the rituals unnecessary because the reality they point to has finally arrived. The sun is rising now. The light spreads across the pool, turning the water gold. The pace at the pool quickens. More people arrive. The sense of urgency increases. The morning sacrifices at the temple will begin soon. The pilgrims need to be pure. They need to be ready. They need to finish their purification, dry themselves, put on clean garments, make their way up through the city to the Temple Mount, enter through the gates, present themselves to the priests, offer their sacrifices, participate in the feast. This is the rhythm of Feast Week. This is the pattern. This is what it means to be part of God's covenant people. But the water is just water. It can wash the skin, but can it wash the soul? It can remove ritual impurity, but can it remove sin? It can make a person fit to enter the temple courts, but can it make a person fit to enter the presence of God himself? These are the questions that lurk beneath the surface of all this activity, questions that the prophets had raised centuries before. "I will sprinkle clean water on you," God said through Ezekiel, "and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you." The prophets foresaw a day when external rituals would give way to internal transformation, when the law would be written not on stone tablets, but on human hearts, when purification would be not just ceremonial, but moral and spiritual and complete. Is this the year that prophecy begins to be fulfilled? Is 33 Anno Domini the year when the living water flows from its true source? The people at the Pool of Siloam do not yet know what we know, looking back from 2,000 years later. They do not know that before this feast week is over, the man who claimed to be the source of living water will be arrested, tried, condemned, and crucified. They do not know that his blood, not the blood of lambs and goats, will be the final sacrifice that makes purification complete. They do not know that his death will tear the temple curtain from top to bottom, symbolizing direct access to God. No more barriers, no more mediation, no more anxiety about whether your purity is sufficient. They do not know that his resurrection will validate his claims, prove his identity, and open the way for a new kind of purification, a purification by the Spirit, a washing of regeneration, a cleansing that goes deeper than any water can reach. But they are about to find out. History is accelerating toward its climax. The collision between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant is imminent, and the Pool of Siloam, that ancient place of purification, stands as a witness to the question every human heart must answer. How do we approach God? What makes us clean? What removes the barrier between us and the holy? Is it ritual? Is it water? Is it sacrifice? Or is it someone else entirely? Look at the faces of the pilgrims one more time. Look at their hope, their devotion, their sincerity. They are doing what they believe God requires. They are following the law as they understand it. They are seeking purity with all their hearts, and God honors that. He honors their faithfulness. He honors their obedience. But He also knows, even if they do not yet, that He has prepared something better for them, something that will fulfill all these rituals while making them ultimately unnecessary, something that will satisfy all the law demands while offering something infinitely greater than the law could ever provide. The water of the Pool of Siloam flows on, cool and clear, doing what it has done for centuries, washing pilgrims, purifying worshippers, preparing people to enter the temple. But even as it flows, another kind of water is being offered, a living water that Jesus spoke of, water that springs up to eternal life, water that satisfies not just the requirements of ritual purity, but the deepest thirst of the human soul. The two waters exist side by side in this moment, the old and the new, the shadow and the reality, the temporary and the eternal. Within days, everything will change. The man who offered living water will give his life. The temple rituals will continue, but their meaning will be transformed. The sacrifices will go on, but the final sacrifice will have been made. The purifications will persist, but the ultimate purification will have been accomplished. The Pool of Siloam will still be there, still offering its waters, but those with eyes to see will understand that it was always pointing beyond itself, always preparing people for something greater, always serving as a symbol of a cleansing that only God Himself could provide. And so, as the morning advances, as the sun climbs higher, as the pilgrims finish their immersions and make their way to the temple, we are left with the image of water and dust and humanity, of rituals ancient and meaningful, of people striving to be pure before their God, of a system that worked but was never meant to be permanent, and of a promise that something new was coming, something better, something that would wash away not just the impurity of the body, but the stain of sin itself. The Pool of Siloam, on a feast week morning in 33 Anno Domini, was a place where the old world and the new world stood side by side, where the covenant of Moses and the covenant of Christ overlapped, where the water of ritual and the living water of salvation flowed in the same city, under the same sky, offered to the same people. Most chose the familiar. Most chose the traditional. Most chose what they knew. But some, a faithful few, were beginning to hear another voice, to see another way, to thirst for another water. And before long, that living water would flow from the cross, from the side of the crucified Messiah, water and blood, purification and redemption, cleansing and salvation, all poured out for a world that did not yet understand how deeply it needed to be washed. This is what the Pool of Siloam was like on a feast week morning. This is what the people experienced, what they hoped for, what they sought, and what they were about to discover was available in a way they had never imagined. The water was real, the rituals were meaningful, the devotion was sincere, but all of it, every drop of water, every prayer, every immersion, every hope of purity was pointing to him, the one who would soon say from the cross, "I thirst," so that our thirst for righteousness, for purity, for God himself, could finally, fully, eternally be satisfied. The daily rhythm of the Pool of Siloam during Feast Week was not merely a religious obligation. It was woven into the very fabric of Jewish identity, into the collective memory of a people who had walked through wilderness and exile, who had lost their temple and rebuilt it, who had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and yet still believed that ritual washing could restore them to the presence of the Holy One. This belief was not superstition. It was covenant faithfulness. It was the acknowledgement that sin was real, that defilement was spiritual reality, and that God himself had prescribed the remedy. By mid-morning, the crowds had thinned somewhat, though the pool never truly emptied during the festival days. Those who had arrived before dawn had completed their ritual baths and made their way up to the temple courts. Now came the merchants, the craftsmen, the families with young children, the elderly who moved more slowly, and those who had traveled from distant villages and needed to wash after a long journey on dusty roads. The character of the gathering changed as the day progressed. The urgent press of those desperate to reach the temple by the hour of sacrifice gave way to a steadier, more measured flow of pilgrims. Women formed a particularly significant portion of the mid-morning crowd. Jewish law and custom dictated that women observe the same purity regulations as men, and feast weeks brought additional opportunities and obligations for worship. Mothers brought daughters, teaching them the prayers, the posture, the proper way to immerse completely so that no part of the body remained untouched by the water. These moments were more than instruction in ritual. They were the passing of faith from one generation to the next, the physical demonstration that belonging to God's people meant something tangible, something that shaped how you lived, how you prepared yourself, how you approached the sacred. The conversations among the women often different from those of the men. Where men might debate points of law or discuss the political tensions with Rome, women spoke of family, of provision, of healing. Many came to the pool with private burdens. A woman unable to conceive would descend into the water with whispered prayers that God would remember her, that the cleansing would somehow extend beyond ritual purity to the deeper barrenness of her womb. A mother whose child was ill would immerse herself with the desperate hope that her renewed purity might make her prayers more acceptable, might move the hand of God toward mercy. A widow, dependent on the charity of relatives, would wash away not just ritual impurity, but the invisible stain of social vulnerability, seeking dignity in the one place where all Israel stood equal before the law. The pool also served as an informal gathering place, a location where information spread, where news was exchanged. During feast weeks, when Jerusalem's population swelled beyond capacity, the Pool of Siloam became a hub of communication. Pilgrims from Galilee would learn which relatives from Judea had arrived. Merchants would hear which roads were safe and which were troubled by bandits. Political whispers circulated, rumors about the Roman governor, speculation about whether this would be the year that the Messiah finally revealed himself. And indeed, messianic expectation hung thick in the air during these feast days. It always did, but in this particular year, in the spring of 33 AD, the tension was more palpable than usual. The name of Jesus of Nazareth was on many lips. Some spoke it with reverence, recounting healings they had witnessed or heard about. Others spoke it with suspicion, questioning whether a man from Galilee, a carpenter's son, could possibly be the anointed one. Still others spoke it with open hostility, repeating the accusations of the religious authorities, labeling him a blasphemer, a deceiver, a threat to the fragile peace with Rome. The Pool of Siloam had become, in a sense, contested spiritual territory. It remained what it had always been, the place of ritual purification prescribed by centuries of tradition. But it was also the site of one of Jesus's most provocative miracles. The man born blind, whose healing had occurred on a Sabbath, had been sent by Jesus to this very pool to wash. When he returned seeing, the miracle ignited controversy that still reverberated through the city. Some who came to wash remembered that event, pointed to the spot where the man had emerged from the water with sight restored, argued about what it meant. For the religious authorities, the healing at Siloam was deeply problematic. It challenged their interpretation of Sabbath law. It occurred at a location heavy with symbolic meaning, and it suggested that Jesus possessed an authority that transcended the traditional channels of religious power. The pool was supposed to represent their system, their mediation between God and the people. If Jesus could bypass all of that, if he could grant healing and purity through his own word and will, what did that say about the necessity of their rituals, their institutions, their control? But for the common people, the majority who came to Siloam that feast week morning, these larger theological battles were distant concerns. They came because it was what Jews did during festival seasons. They came because they believed God required it. They came because their parents and grandparents had come, and their ancestors before them, back through the generations to the time when the law was first given at Sinai. The continuity mattered. The connection to history mattered. The sense that by descending into this water, they were participating in something ancient and holy and larger than themselves. The pool's design facilitated this sense of communal participation. Unlike private ritual baths found in wealthy homes, the Pool of Siloam was public, visible, shared. Your purification was witnessed by dozens or hundreds of others. This was not a private transaction between an individual and God. It was a public declaration of identity, a visible commitment to the covenant. When you emerged from the water, you emerged as part of the people, bound to them not just by ancestry, but by shared practice, shared belief, shared hope. The water itself, flowing fresh from the Gihon spring through Hezekiah's tunnel, carried its own set of meanings. This was not stagnant water, not collected rainwater, but living water in the technical sense that Jewish law defined the term. The Hebrew word for such water, mayim hayim, literally meant living waters, flowing waters, waters that had their source in the natural springs that God himself had placed in the earth. There was a theology embedded in the requirement that ritual purification use such water. It suggested that cleansing came not from human effort or human wisdom, but from God's provision, from the sources he had created, from the life that flowed from his hand. This is why Jesus' words, spoken in Jerusalem during an earlier feast, carried such explosive power. When he stood and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." He was appropriating the language and imagery that every Jew associated with places like Siloam. He was claiming to be the source of the mayim hayim, the living water that could not only wash the outside, but transform the inside, that could not only make you ritually pure, but spiritually alive. Most of the people washing at Siloam that morning had heard some version of Jesus' teaching. Jerusalem was not a large city by modern standards. Word traveled quickly, especially during feast weeks when pilgrims filled every available space and conversations spilled from courtyards into streets, into public gathering places. Some had heard him teach in the temple courts. Others had listened to his parables on the Mount of Olives. Still others knew only second-hand reports, filtered through friends or family, or the inevitable distortions that occur when controversial ideas pass from mouth to mouth. The range of responses to Jesus was as varied as the people themselves. Some who washed at Siloam had already become his followers, though quietly, fearfully, aware that open allegiance could cost them their place in the synagogue, their business relationships, even their family connections. They descended into the pool as observant Jews fulfilling the law, but they did so now with a different understanding, seeing in the water a symbol of something greater, something that Jesus himself embodied and offered. Their immersion was both an act of traditional obedience and a private acknowledgement that all such rituals pointed beyond themselves to the one who made true cleansing possible. Others were conflicted, drawn to Jesus' words, but troubled by his claims. Impressed by his miracles, but disturbed by his challenges to religious authority. They came to Siloam seeking what they had always sought, ritual purity, but now with questions that hadn't existed before. If this Jesus really is from God, What does that mean for all of this? If he can heal and forgive and claim authority over the Sabbath, does that change what we're doing here? Are these rituals still necessary, or are they somehow incomplete, pointing towards something we haven't fully understood? And then there were those, perhaps the majority, who dismissed Jesus entirely, who saw him as a distraction at best and a dangerous heretic at worst. For them, the Pool of Siloam represented continuity and stability, the reassurance that despite Roman occupation and political uncertainty, and all the ways the world seemed to be changing, the covenant remained. God was still God. The law was still the law. The temple still stood. The sacrifices were still offered. The rituals still worked. This Jesus from Nazareth, whoever he was, whatever he claimed, could not overturn centuries of revealed truth, could not replace the system that God himself had established.